My starting point is that I stand in solidarity with democratic, left-wing and civil society Syrians who oppose both the Assad dictatorship, ISIS, all the other jihadists, and of course intervention by foreign powers, including the West, Russia, Iran and Hezbollah. They began their democratic revolution in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring. They called for democratic, free and fair elections. They called for an end to Assad's police state. Assad's police state was not some new invention. It had existed decades before under Bashar's father Hafez. There never have been free and fair elections in Syria for more than 4 decades. In those 4 decades, the regime has censored the media, arrested journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, trade unionists, leftists, LGBT people, and women's rights campaigners. Syria under Assad, both the father and the son, was a fascist dictatorship and is today a fascist dictatorship. I stand with the Syrian people against that dictatorship and against all foreign intervention. I want to see the people of Syria being able to choose their own government freely and fairly in democratic elections based on a free and open press, the right to protest, and all other human rights. It is simply not true that what happened in 2011 was engineered by the West. There may have been Western leaders and military and neocons who wanted regime change in Syria, but that did not in any way influence the mass movement of millions of Syrians for democracy and human rights. The response to those peaceful protests was that the Assad dictatorship turned the police and army on the people, shooting them dead. At the same time, Assad released Islamist terrorists and preachers who were in prison in order to justify that he was going to fight a war on terror. The whole argument, the equation that it's Bashar al-Assad against the terrorists is a fiction. It is Bashar Assad against his own people. And what has happened in Homs, Aleppo and many other cities over recent years, the mass indiscriminate bombing has echoes of Guernica in the 1930s in Spain when the Luftwaffe and Franco's forces bombed that civilian populated area. The vast majority of people killed have been killed by Assad's forces and more recently by the Russians. Every human rights organization documents that and corroborates it. Likewise, we know that the vast majority of dead are civilians, including women and children. Not Islamist fighters, not jihadists, but civilians. It is a war crime to indiscriminately bomb civilian areas. Yet that is what Assad and Russia, his neo-imperialist allies, have been doing in recent years. Bombing civilian populated areas, just like Henry Kissinger did in Vietnam and Cambodia in the 1970s. And he too is a war criminal and should be put on trial. What has happened is a war crime, not just because of the bombing of civilian areas, but because of the bombing of hospitals, mosques and schools, which are also forbidden under the Geneva Conventions. I hold no sway whatsoever with any Western government. I do not take any cue from Western governments or military leaders or from the mainstream media. I listen solely to the democratic, left-wing and civil society activists inside Syria, of which there are still millions. In the non-Assad controlled areas, there are local coordinating committees, which are grassroots democratic organizations which run and provide local services including utilities like water, social services, medical care, and so on. These people are doing what we would expect any progressive person to do. They are Democrats, they are secularists, they are against Islamism and the terrorists. And indeed, in many of the areas which have been occupied by the various Islamist groups, you will know, or I hope you know, that the civilians, the Democrats in those communities, in their thousands, have turned out to protest not just against Assad, but also against the Islamists, to demand they get out of their communities, to stop their terror campaign. So, when approaching this whole issue, we must first and foremost stand with those people who stand for our values: democracy, secularism, and human rights. And millions of Syrians do exactly that. We should be supporting them. And I do not mean military intervention. It's very hard to support them, but at least we can give them moral support. And at least we should be providing humanitarian aid to civilians who are under siege. And when I say humanitarian aid, I mean food, medicine, clothing, and fuel in winter. What we could have done, it's probably now too late, what we could have done and what should have happened was that instead of any Western intervention, never mind Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, instead of any Western intervention, what should have happened in 2012 when the terror campaign by Assad began, the United Nations should have agreed to a UN-mandated arms embargo, a UN-mandated series of civilian safe havens and humanitarian corridors, UN-mandated human rights monitors and observers, and UN peacekeepers, and backed up by a no-bomb zone to stop the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. Now, I would have supported that if it had come from the United Nations, but I would not support it if it was imposed by the West. And indeed, judging from the resolution on 377A just over a year or so ago, a majority of UN member states would have backed those proposals as well. Under the United Nations resolution, responsibility to protect, we do have a moral political duty to protect civilians who are being slaughtered, not by military intervention, but by humanitarian aid and by using the vehicle of the United Nations to do those actions, and very importantly, to set up a serious peace process, a dialogue which must of course include the current Syrian regime, but also the other parties, and in particular, democratic, left-wing and civil society Syrians. That to me is the way to go. I don't know whether it would work, but I think we should try it. And it's certainly better than the fence-sitting and looking the other way that's happening right now. No one in the past would have said, let's look the other way while black South Africans are suffering under apartheid, or Chileans are suffering under the Pinochet dictatorship. We took a stand of solidarity with black South Africans and with democratic Chileans, and we should do the same with democratic, left-wing and civil society activists in Syria today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now to the other Peter.
The picture you have just heard bears no relation to the reality of the situation in Syria. It would be boring and not very productive for me to go through it point by point. But the picture that Peter had portrayed is a gross misrepresentation. The trouble all kicked off in 2011. Yes, there were some demonstrations, but within hours they were taken over by armed jihadis, Muslim Brotherhood fighters who had been preparing for the day for literally years. And very quickly after that, they were being supported by the Western powers. The US ambassador who actually shares the same surname as me and with whom I'm amazingly confused sometimes, Robert Ford, rushed up to Homs, where some demonstrations were taking place, to show solidarity and to demonstrate that the US was fully behind this move to unseat the government of Syria. Now, the government of Syria may not have been at that time an outstanding beacon of democracy or human rights, but show me any government in the Middle East that's better. We are very selective in our indignation. The way Syria was conducted before 2011 was no different to Jordan. It was better, definitely, than Saudi Arabia. And yet we say not a word about the internal conduct of these countries' affairs. After 2011, of course, the new situation, war. And under those conditions, there isn't a government in the world which will not defend itself. And under conditions of urban warfare, that war is always going to be ugly. Now, I want to read to you something from an Amnesty report on Syria. We visited 44 sites and interviewed 112 civilians. The attackers launched airstrikes on buildings full of civilians using wide area effect munitions. We found no information indicating that fighters were present. They used unguided mortars and unguided artillery. There's strong evidence that the attacks violated international law. People hiding in basements were terrified. Hundreds were killed and thousands injured. Horrifying, yes? Shocking, yes? This is the Amnesty International report on what we, the international coalition, did in Raqqa, in the city of Raqqa, only months ago. Urban warfare is terrible. Whoever is conducting it, there's always going to be many civilians tragically killed and suffering. But one thing we can do is not make it worse. And we, the West, including Britain, have been making it worse for the last 7 years. We have been supporting the jihadis who took over from these mythical Democrats who were like snowflakes in the Middle East sun. If Assad was removed today, I'd like to challenge Peter to say what he thinks would happen if Assad were to step down tomorrow. Let us be practical here. We are where we are. If Assad were to go, there would be a bloodbath that would make the killing to date look like a picnic. The first thing that would happen would be a genocide of the Alawite and Christian peoples, those who have not already fled, because they have been ethnically cleansed from the areas controlled by the jihadis. Fortunately, today, 80% of the population of Syria live in areas controlled by the government without any problems. There have been many local reconciliations. And on this point, perhaps there is an area of convergence with Peter, because locally there is, even today, a surprising amount of local grassroots democracy. Many of the fighters, the opposition fighters who have surrendered, have actually joined the local security forces. They gave up their heavy weapons, but they've been allowed to keep their light arms and now constitute the local police. This is not the action of a tyrannical, brutal, flesh-eating government such as it's being portrayed. This is the action of a government that is trying in an incredibly difficult situation to reconcile all its peoples. It's claimed that Assad is a tyrant. Well, look around the Middle East. Tell me, how is it we never call kings tyrants? Why are kings never called dictators? They get a pass. They get a pass. But actually there have been elections in Syria. You can argue about how democratic they are. The important thing is what happens today. We are where we are. There's really not much point recriminating over the past, over what things were like in 2011. We are where we are. And what the West should do, what Britain should do, is stop levying sanctions on Syria. This is the first very basic thing that would help all Syrians. And I'd like to challenge Peter to say that he'll join me in calling on the British government to lift or to work for the lifting of EU sanctions on Syria, because they only penalise the people. I mean, clearly they haven't brought about regime change or caused the government of Syria to change its behaviour. So what is the point? Now, these sanctions are as bad as the sanctions used to be on Iraq. We used to hear more about that. You don't hear about the Syrian sanctions, but believe me, they have brought the Syrian economy to its knees. Sanctions make it impossible to do trade in dollars. In the Middle East, this makes trade virtually impossible and forces trade into black market channels, pushing prices up. It's very difficult to bring medical prostheses into Syria because of sanctions. This is clearly a neutral act that everybody of good faith should be supporting. Secondly, we should stop standing in the way of international aid for the reconstruction of Syria. This is what the Americans are pushing at the moment. No way can there be any international aid until there is a political settlement that we, the Americans, the West, accept. They conditionalize it. Do they care about the suffering of the Syrian people in the meanwhile? Do they help? Anybody who sincerely wants peace and an end to suffering in Syria will support these two acts. Stop sanctions, support international assistance, stop giving propaganda support, practical support to the so-called rebels. This would be a good start. Stop making things worse. There are more constructive actions we could take, but I think my time is running out. We'll come back to that.
Thank you, Peter and Peter. And what I'm going to do something unusual now, because what I want to do, I want to take some voices and opinions, and I want obviously Peter and Peter to answer each other's challenges and questions. But there's a time limitation. Both guys have got to run before 5:30. That's the bottom line. So we're going to be tight, yeah. But I wanted to do this. I wanted to ask you now, as a people here, right? On a show of hands, where's the current sympathy lying in it? Do you feel more inclined to Peter Ford's account, or do we feel more inclined to Peter Tatchell's account of the? Show your hands. Who feels more inclined to Peter Ford's account? And who feels more inclined to Peter Tatchell's account? Oh, who's undecided? No, I was doing that for a reason, because I want to bring some people in now, but I want to do it equally. I don't want to load of people on one side. But I can tell you for now that what that showed is that most people in the Peter v Peter was on Peter's side, Peter Ford's side, but it seemed to me that the undecideds were the majority there. It seemed to me, but that might have just been a snapshot. The first thing I want to do before I give it out to the audience, because there were some direct points made there, I'm going to ask Peter in 5 minutes to respond to some of the challenges that Peter Ford made to him.
Well, I'm very glad that Peter Ford did report the amnesty document about coalition casualties in Raqqa, and I indeed publicised that report as well. The so-called liberation of Raqqa was a war crime because it also involved the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. It was good to get rid of ISIS, but not at that cost to the civilian population. But what I find strange is that Peter has not cited any of the other Amnesty reports, or the reports from Human Rights Watch, or from the dozens of other human rights organizations who have documented the mass killing of peaceful protesters by the Syrian regime. We know that roughly 500,000 civilians have been killed, 90% or more by Assad and Russia. Over 1.5 million wounded and over 12 million displaced. By any standards, these are monstrous crimes against humanity. So I just ask again, selectively quoting from Amnesty is fine to make one point, but if you believe in Amnesty, why don't you, if you think they're credible, why don't you quote all the other reports which firmly put Bashar al-Assad in the dock and say he should be indicted for war crimes? On the question of the evidence, there is so much evidence out there, including evidence smuggled out from defectors from the regime who have documented thousands of photographs of political prisoners and others who have been arrested, tortured and murdered. Just in the last few days, we've had dozens of documents released by the Assad regime itself which confirm the killing of bloggers, of democracy campaigners, of people who worked in search and rescue teams. This is unconscionable, and this is a regime that's not afraid to admit, apparently, its heinous crimes. So far, it's got away with impunity. I think there is a very strong case for the International Criminal Court to issue arrest warrants for Assad, his key government ministers and military officials, plus the Islamist extremists in ISIS, al-Nusra, and the other jihadi organizations. All those who've committed war crimes, on whatever side, should be held accountable and should be given the clear message that you are indicted for war crimes. Now, of course, implementing and executing an arrest warrant is difficult, but symbolically, that is hugely important to send a signal that the world is watching, that we have the evidence. And the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Now, the final point I'd make is, I was asked what would happen if Assad stood down. And the suggestion was there would be a genocidal bloodbath. No, there wouldn't. Assad and his key people should stand down, undoubtedly, but there could potentially be a government of national unity, including elements of the existing Syrian regime and its police and armed forces, who would maintain security and stability, but do so in coalition with the democratic opposition, not the Islamists. And I find it strange that Peter keeps on dismissing the democratic opposition, suggesting there's some tiny, insignificant, or he even used the term mythical democratic opposition. Hey, we all saw the films, the videos. They weren't faked. There were hundreds of thousands, even on one occasion over 1 million people marching, and their cry was freedom, democracy. Nothing about Islamism or terrorism. So I think we need to say very clearly that supporting the democracy movement, and for the democracy movement to be part of a new government of national unity, is a way forward and would not lead to the fratricidal, genocidal strife that Peter predicts. There should be no coalition, no unity with Islamists and jihadists and terrorists. I agree. But for the Democrats, the Syrian left, and the Syrian civil society organizations, they should be part of the new post-Assad disposition.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, can you respond to that?
Well, I noticed Peter declined to respond about sanctions or the way the West is blocking international assistance for the recovery, but perhaps he'd like to...
I apologise, I forgot that. I don't support generalized sanctions, but I do support sanctions targeted at regime officials, but not if they affect or harm ordinary people, not if they harm the civilian population. So only targeted sanctions, and I think, to be honest, they will have limited effect. But again, it's symbolic.
Peter, you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. And you stated that 500,000 civilians have been... You can't have your own facts. You stated that 500,000 civilians had been killed. Well, I'm afraid this is a gross exaggeration. Nobody actually knows how many people have been tragically killed in Syria, but approximately half of the numbers that have been killed are combatant fighters. Over 100,000 government army soldiers have been killed. Many jihadi fighters have been killed. So your numbers are perhaps about 1/4 or 1/3 correct. And that is your argument. You're about 1/3 correct and 2/3 completely wrong. So let's get the facts straight. Amnesty, they didn't get their facts straight, and they've had to row back on disown parts of some of their reports because they have relied on very dubious witnesses, in one notorious case on one single individual, on which they erected this case about the thousands of victims, and they showed photographs that actually turned out to be photographs of war victims, not victims who died in prison. So you have to be selective when you're dealing with Amnesty and Human Rights International, because let's not make angels of these human rights organizations. They have been infiltrated by Western intelligence agencies and heavily influenced by them, and they are fed a lot of information by them. You have to use your own judgment, people. Be selective.
Okay, I'm going to open it up now for some contributions from the audience, and I'm aware of the fact that in the audience we've got an MP here who might be able to share a bit of a sort of parliamentary take on this issue, or on your own, Chris, as well as it. I know we've got Vanessa Beeley here, who's actually been on the ground in Syria, in Aleppo and other places. So I'm going to open it up, but I'm going to ask people to keep it to 2 minutes, yeah? Your contributions to 2 minutes. Can I have if anyone wants to say anything, can we go?
Thanks. So I don't think anybody would in the room would not be supportive of genuine sort of grassroots activism in Syria. Isn't the danger that by opposing Assad now, you're supporting the US's great game, its pathway to Iran?
I'm not interested in the US game plan, and I oppose it. All I'm interested in is the democratic left-wing and civil society activists in Syria. I listen to them and them alone, and they have a just cause. In the same way that black Africans struggling against apartheid had a just cause, the Spanish people struggling against Franco had a just cause, the Chilean people struggling against Pinochet had a just cause. So whatever the US game plan is, and they may have a game plan, they may have a game plan, but I don't care about it. I'm not interested. I don't support it. I oppose it.
Look at Iraq.
Can I ask you something, Peter? If you have an objective which is democracy in Syria and you want to support democratic activists, but their allies are Satan, if you know what I mean. If there was a really bad force that was supporting that aim that you had for their own tactical reasons, wouldn't that make you think, well, I support the Syrian objective of the Democrats, but their allies have got a much more wicked agenda, which if I lend support despite them being there, the danger is that you lend support to the wicked agenda.
Well, the Syrian Democrats have no allies with al-Nusra, ISIS or any other Islamists. The Syrian Democrats oppose the Islamist extremists with the same ferocity that they oppose Assad. And as I mentioned, in many of the areas where the Islamists do have influence, there have been mass protests organized by Syrian Democrats, left-wingers and civil society activists against those Islamists. So the idea that they are somehow together is a complete fiction and a deep slur on the integrity of those very brave Syrians who share exactly our human rights and democracy values. How can we talk about wanting democracy and human rights in this country if we won't support the people who want exactly the same thing in Syria today?
Sorry, Peter, I was talking about the Americans and the British, not the jihadis.
Well, I don't support the Americans and the British. I don't support the Americans and British. I support the Syrian Democrats, left-wingers and civil society activists. I've said it umpteen times.
Peter, I'd really like to know where you've spoken to these magical left-wing democratic activists. Have you spoken to them in Syria or have you spoken to them outside Syria?
I've spoken to them via Skype and other places here.
So you haven't visited these areas where these wonderful left-wing democratic activists are working?
I didn't visit apartheid South Africa. I didn't need to visit.
Can you just answer the question?
Let me answer.
It's a simple question.
No.
Answer the question.
I said
Did you visit the areas where they're active?
Can you let me speak? I said I did not visit apartheid South Africa, but I knew from the information I received from activists there what apartheid was doing, and I stood in solidarity with black and white South Africans struggling against apartheid in the same way that I stand in solidarity with democratic left-wing and civil society Syrians.
Okay, so you haven't visited Syria. Can I actually demonstrate to you the research from somebody that you claimed had done no research, somebody who bothered to go to the areas that were occupied by your so-called civil society democratic activists? And I'm going to keep this very brief, but in East Aleppo, would you consider the local councils to be a part of that democratic organisation in East Aleppo? Simple answer, yes or no.
I'm not going to play your game because yesterday...
Do you consider the local councils to be part of the civil society?
Yesterday, I tried to have a dialogue with you, and 5 times you made fabricated allegations against me.
They weren't
so I'm not going to dialogue with you.
Fabricated.
I'm not going to dialogue.
Prove which part of what I said to you was fabricated afterwards, not now, because I want to get to this point. The civil society that you talk about, for example, in East Aleppo, the local councils who run the local medical centres, who control the Free Syrian Police that I would presume you are considering as part of that civil society activism. Let me explain something to you. The local councils in the terrorist-held areas, so for example Idlib, East Aleppo, Eastern Ghouta, are financed indirectly by the British government via their intermediaries such as Integrity Consulting and Adam Smith International, as was exposed by the BBC Panorama programme regarding the Free Syrian Police acting in Idlib. BBC Panorama made it very clear that those civil rights activists cannot operate without the control of the jihadist elements there. But let me come back to the local councils that controlled all of civil society in occupied East Aleppo. Now, the president of that local council, elected by your so-called civil society activists in 2013, all of this is documented, was a man called Abdulaziz Maghribi. Abdulaziz Maghribi was a part of the armed invasion of East Aleppo in 2012. He was an armed militant with the Tawhid Brigade funded by Turkey. In 2013, he was elected as an armed militant to head up the British-funded local council's shadow state in East Aleppo, designed to distract away from the Syrian government that has the majority of support of the Syrian people, and that has been documented throughout this war by mainstream journalists such as Rana Abazeed of Time magazine and Jonathan Steele of The Guardian. I'm sure you know him. Abdulaziz Maghribi in 2013, as president of that local council, became a leader of Nusra Front and a member of Abu Amara, one of the most vicious jihadi gangs in that area. At the same time, he established the White Helmets in East Aleppo. And you talk about freedom and democracy being the chant of the protesters in the beginning, but you omit, in fact, what you're doing is portraying the Western version of the revolution, not the Syrian version, because Syrians will tell you what they heard was Alawites to the grave and Christians to Beirut. But you omit that element from your rhetoric. And I hope that you will stand by the statement that you made yesterday that there should be an independent inquiry into the White Helmets' atrocities against Syrian people. Thank you.
I can only reiterate that I know, and human rights organisations know, that there are millions, hundreds of thousands, and possibly millions of Syrians who still hold true to the ideal of a democratic, secular state that respects human rights, that opposes religious sectarianism, that opposes Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Assad, and all the Islamists. What you are doing is negating the agency of civilians in Syria who do not support Assad. You seem to be suggesting that no such people exist, or they are marginal and insignificant. I'm saying that the evidence is they are very significant, very substantial, not as substantial as they were once because so many of them have been murdered by Assad and Russia, but there are those people there who stand true to the same democratic secular ideals, and you are trying to say they're not important, they don't exist. I find that very sad.
Peter, they exist, but do you know what they say to me? The actual opposition inside Syria that I've spoken to, they say to me, we want reform, we want change, but we don't want to kill Syria to achieve it, and that is what you should be supporting.
Well, the Democrats are peaceful and non-violent.
Oh.
The democratic left-wing and civil society campaigners in Syria are committed to non-violent resistance. They do not support any kind of armed struggle or any Islamist agenda. They want a negotiated settlement, and they would get it and were prepared to have it if Assad allowed it, but he won't. Just this week, I think, Assad's security chief, Jamal Hassan, has said that 3 million Syrians are wanted for arrest and trial, meaning not just the Islamists, but the Democrats and the human rights campaigners as well.
Unlike Peter, I have been to Syria last 2 years in a row. I was there this April. I got woken up in Damascus by Theresa May's bombs, waking us up in the middle of the night. I was in Aleppo in April, in Homs the previous year, and Aleppo. The picture that Peter is painting here is utterly absurd when you are on the ground inside Syria, and any of you are free to go there and find this out for yourself. Vanessa Beeley here, you said you've never heard of her. This woman has been on the ground in Syria. She's put her life at risk to bring first-hand testimony out of Syria from Syrian people on the ground. I've met Syrian civil society, and they are crying out for Vanessa's voice to be heard, and Eva Bartlett. Those two women are absolute heroes. They have both risked their lives. You can go on 21st Century Wire and read Vanessa's piles of evidence that she's gathered, not from one person, and there's no reason why anyone cannot return to Aleppo, because I was there in April and Aleppo is thriving. What is it? I was in Jebrin refugee camp last year. People were there, they couldn't return to Aleppo because of the jihadists that we support. Moderates do not exist. Get past this propaganda. Do not listen to your corporate media or the people that feed Peter Tatchell with his absolute rubbish. Even a NATO report that was suppressed, I think 2012, estimated Assad's support among the people at 70%, and it's even higher now. You go to Syria. I've been to Damascus. I've walked the streets. I was in East Aleppo last year, 4 months after the liberation, because that is what the people call it, their liberation. People came out of their houses to tell us what they'd suffered under the terrorists, and they call them by no other name. You stand in front of an old man who says the terrorists that your government supports killed my 6 children in front of my eyes. Go to Homs and speak to another old man who said when the jihadis came, when the terrorists came, that your government supports, when I wouldn't join them, they killed my 3 grown-up daughters in front of me, one of whom had just had a baby. These stories go on and on and on. Go on 21st Century Wide. Don't listen to someone who's never been to Syria. And what an insult to say there was no democratic election. It was observed by a team of international observers, including from the USA and Canada, who actually held a press conference to object about the distorted reporting. What an insult to the people Eva Bartlett, another great journalist, observed, walking in their hundreds through the sun to get to the embassy in Beirut so that they could vote. Come on, open your eyes, people.
This is sparkly, but time's moving on, and both Peters have to go in 5 minutes tops. 1 minute tops, yeah. Peter, I'm conscious here. I need you.
Well, the people of Syria are voting with their feet. They are streaming back into Syria in their thousands every week. If Syria was the Syria the picture painted by Peter Tatchell, this would not be happening. And you know what? Our government and the American government, all the Western governments, are discouraging, actually actively discouraging this movement of Syrians back into Syria because they don't want the Russians to have a success. I'll leave you with that thought.
Peter paints one picture, I paint a different. What about the millions who left Syria and 90% of them said it was not to escape ISIS, but to escape Assad? Millions. Over 6 million fled. Over 6 million.
People returned to Aleppo and they're living in peace.
We'll have to agree. We will have to agree
You've
to just.
been there.
You've
never been there.
Look, you don't have to go somewhere to know the facts, and we all know the people. We all know the people who went to the old Soviet Union and praised Joseph Stalin.
It's a beautiful day. What a beautiful day. That's the way to end it, because it's going to kick off there. Thank you, Peter Tatchell. Thank you, Peter Ford. God bless you all, mate.